think, piano and the arts, and then got into philosophy, so that's an interesting thing. She's incredibly well published. She's got 16 books, mostly solo written. She's got 7 edited collections, countless book chapters and articles, and so her main field is cultural theory, a little bit different from a lot of the work that we've been seeing at the Cost Action Network. She works on Milton and Blake. She's written a few books on irony, on feminist theory. So she is really at the cutting edge of what is sometimes called the environmental humanities, or geo-humanities sometimes, that's a better term. And she's really at the forefront of philosophizing about the Anthropocene and about climate change. So, you know, she's really crucial. I completely agree with the program committee of getting her to speak here. She's got a couple of books at this thing called Open Humanities Press, which is freely downloadable. So if you're interested, do go and get that. It's 2 volumes on extinction, and so she's really sort of a theorist who's putting extinction on the theoretical agenda. So, this is badass stuff. If you're talking about the Anthropocene, if you're talking about climate change, then a logical, ultimate pathway is to think about, okay, what does it mean that humans might actually, they will disappear, of course, but the question is when, how, and what should we do in the present on an ethical and political level to deal with that fact. Yeah, I mean, I prepared a little introduction to sort of praise her and stuff, but I'll quickly say that I think she's absolutely crucial for thinking about climate change and thinking about migration and displacement. She is, as a number of Australian feminist theorists, one of the very few who thinks of gender and sexual difference not as something that is just discursive or psychic, but that is irreducible. So if you're thinking about the earth, if you're thinking about the future, then these feminist philosophers say, well, it's not just talking about how women suffer more than men usually because of climate change, because of capitalism, but it's the very way of thinking that has to change because of feminist philosophy. So I think we've not seen a lot of feminist theory maybe at this series of conferences, but I think that makes her intervention really crucial for this meeting. Secondly, she's one of the best readers of Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher which I've also worked with or on, and Deleuze is, I think, the most significant philosopher for all of these themes. A large number of geographers, including Nigel Clarke and Andrew themselves, work on Deleuze, and so she reads Deleuze in a much more critical vein, and she's not about the touchy-feely aspect of life as creative and life as inventive and self-transcending, but she's really much more critically thinking about life as full of problems and full of dead ends which you have to deal with. So she's very good in that kind of critical ethical thinking. And lastly, when it comes to climate change and climate refugees, I think she's in this paper going to make quite a disturbing argument, but also very important argument. She's actually saying, well, climate refugees are fundamental to thinking about the human as such. So all humans are finally some kind of climate refugee. So instead of seeing these people as something which are separate and accidental and sort of need to be protected or dealt with, actually we should be thinking about the whole species as finally refugees and as vulnerable to climatic variation. You could make an analogy with disability studies. Instead of saying, well, these people are disabled and the rest is normal. No, what about saying that all humans are actually disabled to a certain degree and to a certain level? Okay, so I'm going to read the paper. I mean, how much time do we have, Andrew? Like 45 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess we will then have some discussion. I mean, there's not going to be questions, I guess, but you can just have comments and whatever. Let's see what will happen. So the title is Scale and Refuge, Twilight of the Anthropocene. Just by the way, that this is also a book that she recently co-wrote, Twilight of the Anthropocene. Okay, here goes. I want to undertake 3 maneuvers. I want to deconstruct the concept of the refugee, and then deconstruct the temporality of climate change, and finally suggest that even though we can only see something other than the Anthropocene in the moment that such alternatives appear as no longer possible, we should nevertheless explore such fully real alternatives at the level of potentiality. The we I deploy here is drawn from the imposed logic of the Anthropocene itself, and one I shall aim to contest in a number of registers. It may once have been the case that we could refer to humanity and its notion of sovereign personhood as one point of view amongst others, a point of view that is peculiar in its universalism, in seeing everyone as human just like me, varying only in culture and expression and mode of production. Now certain voices are objecting to the notion that there is no humanity in general, proclaiming that the discovery of humans as a geological force reunites a species at the level of impact, and such reunification in turn shifts political possibility. We cannot posit other non-Western modes of living with the Earth, for the Earth has now been so inscribed as to offer no exit. Thus, precisely at the moment that Western man appears bankrupt and as a mode of dwelling that is not universal, the cold, hard brutality of climate change at the level of Earth as a living system precludes anything other than the languages of globalism, humanism, and technoscience. We might say that we are now glimpsing the destructive and singular force of the trajectory of enlightenment, precisely when the light of reason appears both to be a light that is so blinding that it precludes other potentialities, and when there is nowhere else to go. And the strange intertwining of the waning of the light of reason at the point of its demise and of its triumph, because it erased potential modes that might have saved it, is at once planetary and discursive. How do we negotiate this problem of capture? Just as we cannot erase the harm done to the planet and finally accept that the path of technoscience and globalism might not have been taken and might have enabled a humanity not subjected to climate change, so we cannot erase the discourses of sovereignty, nation, personhood, and citizenship that recruited modes of dwelling on this earth that were not oriented to property, survival, and human exceptionalism. What I want to challenge in this paper are 2 modes of capture that assume what Jacques Derrida referred to as a silent presupposed we of humanity. And instead I want to make a claim for a world in which the people are missing. Rather than accept that the Anthropocene is a form of political game changer that requires us to think of ourselves as a single humanity because of the acceptance of Earth as a living system, and even more importantly, rather than thinking of the history of Western sovereignty and metaphysics as a non-negotiable system that we can only solicit from within, ironically or tactically, I want to explore the complex of refuge in a series of senses to think about living otherwise, in a mode not oriented to sustaining what has come to be known as humanity in general. To anticipate what follows, I want to argue for a real distinction in modes of reading. The first mode assumes an inescapable horizon of a single scale. However one approaches other cultures or persons, one always does so with some degree of incorporation and appropriation. My world is always my world, and I can only approach the other's world as other than my world. There is an inescapable and transcendental horizon, and the reading of other texts always takes place from a necessary attempt to think another world that is also ultimately impossible. By contrast, one might argue that reading is the intuition of a real and not numerical or formal distinction. It is not that I can grasp and hold the other's world, but rather that something world annihilating occurs if one reads at all. What one encounters is not a variant of a presupposed humanity that is a condition of any possible encounter, but something akin to what Paul de Man referred to as materiality, a matter perceived with an eye that did not see it perceived as the sign of some interconnected world, or what Deleuze and Guattari referred to as really distinct qualities that need not be assigned to a subject for whom the world is given. With this in mind, I want to think of refuge in three distinct senses, rather than think of something like humanity that is enclosed within a post-Anthropocene world from which there is no refuge. It should still be possible to refuse what is being touted as the inescapably human, a single humanity operating at a non-negotiable scale of the Anthropocene. Second, rather than think of the refugee as a modern, exceptional, and threateningly dehumanizing accident, I want to see the modern Western citizen of personhood with nationality and sovereignty as the exceptional and violent appropriation and capture of a milieu of constant refuge that then creates the modern refugee as a pathological case. And finally, I want to argue for a mode of unenlightened reading, a reading that takes place at twilight. We, the we that is foisted upon us after the Anthropocene, can now see that the trajectory of enlightenment operated by a light so intense that it not only precluded a vision of other modes of life, but it also destroyed a certain type of personhood that it proclaimed to be universal. Rather than accept that this lighter point of view is now, despite having recognized itself as blinding, coming to an end and bringing every other light with it, I want to think about what it might mean to read other lights. If it is the case that refuge, rather than personhood, is the condition from which humanity managed to create a violent and temporary hiatus of stability, then it also ought to be possible not to take refuge in other modes of life, but to raise the sense that refuge is a seeking of a proper home, for there is no proper home. Home, humanity, and person are utterly improper, achieved by a theft, a displacement, or a brigandry that conceals itself by producing others as literal refugees. Or more accurately, there is only the improper, only refuge, displacement, migration, but for a brief period of the planet's history, some bodies took themselves to be properly human and properly ecological, as though the world was a climate, an environment, and natural habitat, a nature oriented to the good of all. There has been much debate about the legitimacy of the category of climate refugees. Is this really a distinct category, or are we once again blaming broad, inhuman, climactic factors to cover over the brutal political forces that displace individuals? Here, rather than argue for the inclusion of climate refugees within the category of the modern refugee, whose position of appealing for refuge in a nation other than that of his citizenship already requires modern geopolitical conditions, I want to deconstruct the concept of the refugee. What appears to be parasitic and accidental, the displacement of persons who then have to seek refuge elsewhere, is the condition for what appears to be proper. Life as such is displacement in face of one's milieu becoming hostile. The origin of organic life from single-celled organisms can be traced to the movement towards metabolism of oxygen. It is not that there are no individuals with a proper place and intentionality who embark upon movement. Rather, it is from movement and migration that relative stabilities are formed, not in a stabilization of oneness, but in a relation among forces. The first single-celled organisms relied on light and oxygen for outside energy. What we parochially value as the complexity of life occurs not by assuming a proper locale and then negotiating an outside, but by a constant, disruptive, and appropriating improper relation to an equally unstable outside. The interior is but a brief and fleeting effect of constant drift. It is the movement from insufficient to energizing milieus that subsequently allows for the boundedness of relative stability and the relative stability of life forms. Pretty fucking dense. Okay. Human life is an intensification of a process that might be referred to as transcendental climate refugee. Transcendental climate refuge. If a milieu were to satisfy the energy demands of a body completely, then there would be no need for increasing the complex systems to emerge in the first place. One might think of civilization or the development of polities that colonize and displace others as a consequence of finding one's own milieu to be insufficient at the level of energy. With this displacement then involving the displacement and harnessing of energy from elsewhere. What appears as the proper condition from which the modern refugee has fallen away, citizenship, nation sovereignty, is actually an intensification of a broader horizon of displacement and migration. There can be proper sovereign nations blessed with the condition of justice and rights only after borders have been secured or relatively closed. And not only is such enclosure a contraction, an event of resistance from a milieu of ongoing migration and displacement, I might even say that the history of colonization, appropriation, and enslavement allowed certain nations the luxury of declaring themselves to be independent republics of rights and freedoms. After a history of colonizing, enslaving, and appropriating energy from elsewhere, such nations could then declare themselves to be universally human and hospitably open themselves to only the very deserving few who might be genuine refugees, rather than opportunistic migrants. In short, the sovereign nation is a privileged extraction from a condition of migration and refuge that, broadly speaking, enabled a stable climate and benevolent nature at the expense of others who had to contend with volatility. That is, what came to be experienced as nature, as an unchanging eternal world of seasons, what appeared as an environment, a horizon, a life world, a world of meanings, possibilities, and projects, such as the world of industrial agriculture, was actually affected by creating a world of citizens that would eventually conceal its condition of having sought refuge by displacing others on a global scale. We might think of the history of colonization as a trajectory of man that embarked on intensive nature-stabilizing agriculture by enslaving others, and then proceeded to take over more and more territory to fuel the demands of the host nation. Dumping waste, this is between brackets, dumping waste is a 21st century continuation of this practice that couples pristine stability with displaced unsustainability. If today we are beginning to imagine all of humanity as being in the condition of seeking refuge because of an increasingly volatile and poisoned planet, then it might be better to think less of this as a loss of what we are properly entitled to and more as a resurgence of an opening displacement and migration that had been always warded off and always at the expense of others. We seem to be offered a choice. Either there is something we can do to survive into the future and thrive as humanity in general, or it is game over and we might as well crash and burn. There seems to be no point in acting or thinking differently if the end or collapse of humanity is already certain. This seems to offer us the choice of no choice. We either shift gear to the new scale of the Anthropocene, where intervention occurs at the level of the planet as living system by way of geoengineering rather than the eco-political level of relations amongst humans and their relations to an ecosystem, or we hold on to the hope and declare war on anyone who denies that we, the people, cannot seize upon the climate crisis to create a new and better world for all humans globally equally. But this is a false exclusive discussion. We should not accept a shift of scale to the geological, geopolitical Anthropocene that will be required to save us, as though our survival were a prima facie good, nor should we hold on to the political hope that there might be a better humanity for all if we, the people, revolutionize and hold capitalism to account. For that hope, too, is one of sustaining and surviving in a better and enhanced world. If we follow Naomi Klein, we might see the crisis of anthropogenic climate change as the opportunity for the system of rapacious global capitalism to be tempered so as to allow justice for all. Those who have criticized Klein have done so by way of sobering realism, insisting that she does not face up to the necessary sacrifices, for example, and that the win-win scenario she paints plays into the hands of the climate change deniers who have insisted that claims for ecological crisis are just a conspiracy of the left to take control of markets and our freedoms. We might ask whether the vision of the Anthropocene, a claim about a new mode of the Earth as living system, necessarily shifts political questions to a new scale, a need for emergency measures that can no longer be solved by ameliorating capitalism. Perhaps the choice is not between insisting on the human political scale versus the Earth as a system, between humans bonding together to survive as flourishing global humanity versus the expertise of geoengineers. I want to argue that we should reject the exclusive disjunction and the false conditional that begins with the antecedent, if we are to survive, ... Even if, as the claims for the Anthropocene seem to demand, the only path to survival is to abandon all traditionally political modes and shift to the register of the Earth as a system, with geoengineering being our only realistic or actual path forward, Should we assume the path forward and actuality as incontestable goods? Even if other modes of humanity, the value of which is only discernible now with the triumphant decay of the Anthropocene, are no longer possible, if we are determined to survive, are such other humanities not yet worthy at the level of potentiality? It may be true that if we want humanity to survive as it is, then our only option is geoengineering. Such is the scale of the problem. It may be true that if we accept Naomi Klein's utopian future, then we can believe in a world of justice and plenty when capitalism is finally overthrown by collective action. What I want to suggest in what follows is that we think beyond the possible and the actual towards the virtual. We do not need to be poised between the Hobson's choice of believing either in a promised land where humanity continues in a better and more just form, or a catastrophe so great that only geoengineering will save us. Perhaps lost and impossible forms of humanity still have something to say to us, precisely insofar as they destroy the us that is oriented only to its own calculus of possibility. In 1972, in response to a refusal by the Australian government to grant Indigenous Australians land rights, awarding mining rights instead to a corporation, Australian Aborigines erected a tent embassy outside the Australian House of Parliament. By constructing this embassy, the Aboriginal peoples performatively declared themselves to be aliens in their own land, but also implicitly took part in discourses of sovereignty and nationhood. They were therefore, in the very gesture of declaring themselves alien in their own lands, also becoming discursive hostages, having to deploy the concepts of nation, sovereignty, ownership, land rights, and legitimate usage that were the hallmarks of the very legal system that had allowed Australia to be declared terra nullius in the Supreme Court of the Northern Territories 1971 decision of Milirpum versus Nabalco Limited. The land was deemed to be not occupied because it was not being used in a manner deemed to be legitimately productive. By assembling as an embassy and occupying land in front of the House of Parliament, the Aboriginal people were forced to seek refuge, having been deprived of their homeland and yet having nowhere to flee. But rather than looking back to imagine a better world in which the tent embassy might have led to a recognition of sovereignty and title prior to the overturning of terra nullius in 1982, I would argue that it was the conceptual conditions of the entire discourse of refuge, of nations' homelands' rightful existence, that had precipitated, enabled, and sustained displacement. One might say that in order to be a refugee, or in order to seek the protections and representation an embassy might afford, certain theoretical assumptions must already be in play, most notably those of personhood, sovereignty, and nation, all of which are now reaching their limit and beginning to wane precisely because of the intensive relations between human being and earth that such concepts entailed. That is to say, when indigenous peoples become refugees in their own land and have to seek nationhood by setting up as an external sovereign people, as it did in the 1972 tent embassy, they have already bought into and must buy into discourses of sovereignty that become compulsory at the moment they also become impossible. What I want to do in this paper is tie that event of 1972 of being rendered an alien in one's own land while also being deprived of all possibility of refuge with the condition of humanity in general. It is possible to say, distorting the work of Giorgio Agamben, that all humans are now homo sacer, no longer protected by the rights and justices of personhood, and that they have become bare life to be exposed to the sheer difficulty of living on. However, whereas Agamben sees bare life as an effect of the singular trajectory of sovereignty, and one that needs to be overcome by finding another logic that would enable a happy, blessed life, not defined against or outside the law, I want to argue that Agamben's implicit ideal, a life that is nothing other than its own coming into form, and where a community might be formed by each one of us not having to be in anything other than our singular thisness, is one more iteration of an exceptionally worthy humanness that can operate only by luxuriously positing exposed life as the exceptional outside, all the while relying on a life so irreducibly human that it may one day achieve a blessedness not at odds with a world that is finally and properly home. That was quite a sentence. Rather than consider the state of the refugees and this increasingly prevalent condition of human exposure within the frame of biopolitics, I would like to consider that what has seemed to be an exceptional and contentious category, that of the climate refugee, is now an appropriate way of beginning to think about humans in general. One might say that there is no refuge from what has become the scale of the Anthropocene. And this is so even as that scale casts every other potential humanity into the shadows and operates at such an intensity that its very specificity is discernible only in the moment of its decline. The mode of hyperconsumption and hyperproduction that generated a species capable of altering the dynamic of the Earth's living system, the same humanity of globalism, universalism, and personhood, can only be seen as the limited condition of a portion of humanity precisely at the point at which it sweeps all humanity into its moment of decline. Today, in the light of the scale of the Anthropocene, we are compelled, supposedly, to shift away from ecological justice among humans to the predicament of the Earth as a whole, the possible value of other modes of humanity discernible in the light of the Anthropocene can now only appear as a path not traveled and now closed off forever, at least in human time. Why did the Aboriginal people of 1972 feel compelled to occupy a space and claim a certain type of sovereignty, and what was sacrificed in so doing? One might make three observations regarding the refuge taken within the Australian legal political system. In terms of geopolitics, for the Aboriginal people, and because of colonization and its long reach, there was nowhere else to go. This was so both discursively, where the opportunity to occupy a space required submitting to discourses of sovereignty and nationhood, and geopolitically, where the colonization of Australia as a single landmass precluded any possibility of dispersed, nomadic, and differing peoples. This condition of being bound to the same space has only intensified. As climate change becomes more evident, other modes of dwelling and modes of sovereignty not based on ownership and property are seen to be less and less viable. In addition to the enclosure within a space that is one's own and yet alien, and in addition to a discursive and political legal capture that can only define a sovereignty intertwined with ownership and property, one might think of climate change as having created a further mode of capture. If the Earth is increasingly rendered toxic for all, and if the solution to this toxicity is deemed to be either geoengineering or Marxist revolution and the transformation of capitalism, then it seems that we are left with one scale only, the scale of man, and hence the scale of dwelling tied to personhood, wholeness, and stabilization. So let us imagine that there was a possibility, perhaps in 1972, that the Australian government had, even within the discourse of sovereignty, granted Aboriginal peoples something like native title, or had weakened the extensiveness and intensity of colonial globalism in the manner of the later 1982 High Court decision of Mabo versus Queensland that overruled Milirrpur versus Nabalco of 1971. Climate change in its narrow sense was already in play in the difference that Mabo both made and didn't make. Yes, sovereignty was recognized, but the granting of native title took place within the geopolitical order of intensive industry that had already generated a single scale of human capture. So there was already no way in 1972 that Aboriginal peoples might have existed with their own temporality and their own geotemporality, existing alongside late 20th century industrialism. There were then encroaching economic and cultural imperatives that swept everything into the same scale. Not only were their own modes of existing with the earth being displaced by mining and industrialized agriculture, the colonizing reach of Western capitalism and the intensive hyperconsumption that led to deforestation, ocean acidification, and global warming, while only reaching the pitch of what would have geological impact in the late 20th century, had already generated the single ecological, economic, and conceptual scale that is now explicitly named the Anthropocene. Australian Aborigines, like all Indigenous peoples, were already climate refugees. Indigenous peoples were displaced as a consequence of global capitalism's continued need for further space and resources. When in 1972 and into the 21st century, mining interests supplanted all other ways of thinking about the earth, all other ways of thinking about the Earth, the relation between indigenous Australian erasure and climate change became even more explicit. Those forms of life that might not have generated geological impacts, at least if you are to think about the scale of stratigraphy, were always the victims of a mode of humanity that can now, in the waning light of hyper-industrialism, be referred to as Anthropocene man. I would suggest then that if we accept Clive Hamilton's criticism of those whom he claims do not understand the science of Earth as a living system, we should not be defining the Anthropocene at a political level, to do with how humans behave amongst each other in terms of an ecosystem, and should instead shift the scale to think of the Earth as a whole and its shift to a post-Holocene volatility. However, and at the same time, rather than accept this actual brute fact of the Anthropocene that trumps all interhuman relations, one might say that the thinking that precipitated the intensity of consumption responsible for the Anthropocene was a global political humanism that colonized the Earth and all other humans to the point that no refuge or other space was possible, and that this subsumption of all other modes of thinking occurred before the geological subsumption of the Anthropocene. Rather than scaling up from global humanism in its liberal and Marxist forms, I would suggest that we open virtually other scales in order to live out days on the planet where we are all now left without refuge. Let me just get some water. The Anthropocene does not label anthropogenic climate change in its narrow sense, or the impact of humans on their environment. Rather, it refers to the way certain forms of impact have shifted the planet away from the Holocene's characteristic calm and stability to a higher degree of volatility. When this occurs, what happens is a shift of scale such that geology, a discipline that once did not really connect with humans at all, now becomes a legitimate scale for considering human life. Further, the shift in scale from smaller to geological considerations, where humans now transform the planet and not just ecosystems, necessitates a shift in political scale. It is not possible now anymore to argue for the redemption or refuge that might be achieved by turning towards eco-feminist, indigenous, or nomadic forms of human dwelling. Returning to the Aboriginal Embassy, where indigenous Australians had already lost a battle to fight at a politico-historical scale broader than that of Western colonizing history, and where their only mode of occupying a space was to use the discourse of sovereignty and nationhood, we could say, now that we know that Anthropocene will have been, that Aboriginal claims for land were already caught up in the single scale of global re-territorialization. Here I draw upon Deleuze and Guattari's theorization of the genesis of man by way of a theory of stratification. If territorialization produces a relatively stable identity by way of an occupation of space, in which tendencies enter into relation to become quantities, deterritorialization establishes a point that allows those tendencies to be seen as emerging from some governing ground. Prior to relations and organization, therefore, there is deemed to be some body without organs that is the condition of relations. And this is, no, it's not a quote. Higher deterritorialization would involve thinking this plane of potentiality without seeing it as the ground or causal force behind actual relations. The body without organs would not be a foundation expressed in organisms, but an always present potentiality for disorganization. In this respect, we might imagine from the closure of the Anthropocene other human histories that were not actualized but that still haunt the present. In this respect, one could see various mythic systems as ways of thinking the ordering of relations, where every aspect of the earth or of life opens to a sense of the whole. Following Eduardo Viveros de Castro, one could think of the ways in which each aspect of the world unfolds a different way of making sense of the world, generating multiple and divergent scales. Humans identify and differentiate themselves to other forces in the world. even if, at the level of brute fact and actuality, there can be no retrieval of a pre-Anthropocene world where one might have lived without reaching the intensity of planetary destruction, one might think, in these closing days, in the light of what we know, of living as if other temporalities and planes were possible. Rather than say that the 21st century is marked by knowing that what we need to do in order to survive and yet acting otherwise, we might think of knowing full well that the game of survival and extension is no longer possible, and that this thought generates itself a virtual and fully real counter-Anthropocene. There is no other planet, and there is no other history. There is now no other possible humanity, and yet the potentiality of the history that is not actualized might open up another world in the present. A potentiality of virtual humanity that might have been other than the hyper-consuming industrialized humanity that generated the Anthropocene was still imaginable, if not possible, at the time of the formation of their Aboriginal 10th embassy and later at the time of the Marble decision. Even at that point, which was also the beginning of a sense of the destructiveness of globalizing technoscience, those displaced by colonization and its ravages could only seek refuge within and thereby confirm the same system of nationhood, sovereignty, and land ownership. The humanity of high industrialism is recognizing that its global reach and inescapability is precisely that which will make any sort of actual refuge impossible. And yet it is the same humanity that deems itself in a series of climate refuge fantasies of colonizing other planets as unquestionably worthy of survival. It is possible to recognize by way of the all-encompassing and non-negotiable scale of the Anthropocene, where all parts of the earth are now caught up in the predicament generated by one mode of colonizing humanity, that the single scale or single system thinking that allowed for the historical success of one mode of humanity at the expense of others, and that enables all the technological expertise capable of theorizing the Anthropocene, is also one from which we have no refuge. But this is true only if we think of refuge as us finding a home elsewhere. There is refuge if we think of displacement and migration that does not rely on moving only in order to save itself. So rather than say that Anthropocene forces us to think of ourselves as a single geological force and that the scale trumps all others, I want to suggest that this is only true if we are committed to saving what calls itself humanity. One way of thinking about humanity is that we are now refugees, all of us held hostage by climate change and a geopolitical order from which we must seek refuge, even if we have nowhere else to go. Alternatively, we might refuse this imposed single scale and ask what might be possible if we think at the scale of refuge, where there is no humanity that has a right to seek its future elsewhere and where there is nothing other than a milieu of migration from which what appears as stable scales can emerge. Whatever the past injustice and potentiality of other modes of humanity might have been, the trajectory of Western hyperconsumption and colonization has led to an inescapable interconnectedness that at once erases and consumes those modes of being not aligned with the trajectory of the Anthropocene. This is true at the scale of geology and geopolitics, but why do we accept that other scales are not possible, simply because they do not enhance our survival? In this respect, one might say both that all refugees are climate refugees displaced by forms of war and colonization that are tied to overconsumption and overproduction, and that humanity in general is now approaching the condition of being a climate refugee. Yet one might also say that this world of humanity creating itself as a stable global whole at the expense of generating refugees and then finding itself in the condition of refugee itself allows for what I want to consider a higher deterritorialization. All humans, even and especially those who have suffered from Western colonizing globalism, are now finding the space of the earth to be inhospitable, and yet also finding that the seeking of refuge keeps them within the very system that calls displacement. But how might we think on another plane if refuge is not finding a home elsewhere, but allowing for a highly improper migration? In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari refuse the notion of either a subject or horizon for whom there would be perceptions. They refuse both physically and metaphysically and metaphysically the notion of a proper scale. If geology is one stratum amongst others, then today what appears to be disclosed by geology, humans having a species impact, needs to be read alongside other pre-geological and post-geological stratifications. What we know as this physical reality, our material universe, emerges from movements of relative stabilization, where really distinct qualities are formed and which are capable of being intuited. If there is a discourse of geology that can read the Earth as having a history, there are other stratifications that can see this history as expressing the formation of particles into vital and physical matter. Just as geology can be read both as a form of content that expresses itself in the history of the Earth and its epochs and eras, so geology can be seen as a form of expression that allows us to read the history of particles in the formation of substances. Geology can be a form of substance or a form of expression. The distinction between geological substances and forms and, say, the substances that forms of physics is a real distinction, and for there is no matter in general, only matter as stratified. We could, by extension, see human organic life as an expression of the substance of organic life in general. Or we can see human organic life as a content that expresses itself in literary and cultural forms. The mistake would be to see one stratum as a form of substance that explains everything else as a form of expression. In this respect, one might take the title of Geology of Morals, this is the title of a chapter in the book she's talking about, not as a variant of genealogy, where one traces an emergence of morality as having derived from the earth, where geology is the proper scale at which we ought to think. Rather, there would be something moral about geology itself, establishing matter as we know and live it as a substance that expresses itself in the life of the earth. If the geological scale is the effect of forms, substances become distinct by operating both as distinct content and distinct expressions, then one might look just as legitimately at other stratifications, and this is indeed what the Deleuze do with a certain conception of literature. If literature can be seen as a form of expression, with human historical life as its form of content, this is because we read it at the scale of strata and what has to be called either the life world or more recently the strata of humanity. But such a stratification is possible only by a capturing of elements that might open other stratifications. What if such elements were released from the stratification that sees all materiality as signifying a world for a subject? What if matters were released to generate a form of movement or migration not tied to man? It might seem that this is where Deleuze and Guattari fall back upon a high modernist aesthetic of pure matters that enable depersonalization that is ultimately a higher form of godlike personality. But what if one could seize hold of one element or particle that were inhuman? This, I think, is not as abstract and francophile as it might sound, or it needn't be. I want to conclude with two examples drawn from semi-traditional and contemporary indigenous Australian creation. What if art were not art, not the expression of the human hand that could be traced back to purposeful life, but the assembling of matters that generated a space of earth and a stratification of bodies across what are elsewhere known as species? The hand then seizes ochre and inscribes a line on rock that resonates with the migration of an animal. These human movements are not those of a self, not of a subject or an I, and certainly not proper to man and his archive. It is not too far a stretch to say that what some forms of literature allow for, it is not too far a stretch to say that what some forms of literature do is allow the I to be recomposed as an aspect or expression of a series of matters. If today some writers are lamenting the loss of a self, for whom the archive was marked by signatures and proper names and allowed each one of us to say I in a mode of private reading and deep attention, then this is because literature too has too easily been defined as a book that is held in the hand, read as an intentional object that opens the world of another and allows the reader to reflect upon the horizon of meanings that composes the life world. But that mode of reading was also an effect of global displacement, the manufacture of stable privacy. personal reading, and a world that could appear as content and as context. Even if this literary lyric tradition, even in this literary lyric tradition, there has always been a counter-literature of positive refuge, of migration and composition through alien milieus. One might think here of the ways in which the most masterful texts, signed by the hand of an utterly unique person, such as engravings of William Blake, expose the self to be composed of fleeting and mobile matters. I think that was an abrupt end. So that's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's.
I think it's unfinished.
No doubt, an unfinished piece. I mean, challenging for us to follow, but there are elements of it that, we can. And you did a fantastic job of reading it, having not seen it until about 15 minutes before you started reading it. So, well done. Thank you.
Yeah.
For that. Yes.
I was just very eager to hear what she was going to say, but I think, it needs to be pushed a little bit, I guess.
Sure. Do you want to, we've just asked a lot of you. Do you want to just have a seat and collect yourself? Because no doubt you've got thoughts that have emerged while you were reading it, but we've had the luxury of just sitting and listening. So obviously we're not in a position to pose questions of Claire or even to Arun, because it would be unfair to him to speak for her. But maybe you've been provoked by some of what Claire has been trying to argue, and if you were, then maybe you might offer some thoughts, on how that, on how she provoked you. Yeah, mm-hmm. We can do that, and then maybe come back to Arun, because no doubt you'll have some insight into what she's the argument that she's making for us. Does that sound all right? Does anyone care to begin?
I could probably.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific.
I think one of the things that she's doing, or one of the things that I'm kind of familiar with from her work, is taking geology or the Earth as this sort of potentiality. I think that she's recognised that one of the things that Earth system science does, although it sounds kind of like the latest thing and the most fashionable thing, is the way that it takes the Earth kind of as this entire system. Sometimes also, I think, loses something of perhaps even an older geology, which is and she uses the term stratigraphic quite a lot in her work, this sense of an Earth that's always emerging in potential. I think she's kind of playing off different kind of senses of geology against each other. I think that sense that I think she's getting through Deleuze and Guattari, that any sort of territorialization, including the kind of notion of nation-state sovereignty, is always kind of temporary and provisional on an Earth that's constantly, in a way, has emergent potentials that keep on coming. So you can never really have a kind of a territory or a nation-state that's not, in some senses, kind of provisional in some way. So that's just like one kind of angle on it, I guess, from listening to this through another work that I'm quite familiar with.
Well, Anya, please, and then we'll hear from you.
I would like to follow up on it, because I also understood it in that direction a little bit. The debate we already have, that what is so specific about this, let's say, this joint threat, if we want to call it, of climate change. It really erodes our concept of nation states, of territorial integrity, of state sovereignty. And what I liked so much about this here now is that it can even sort of challenge the terminology of refugees, migrants, which are very closely connected to territoriality and nation states, because you're only a migrant from, if you have some sort of state behind you. Maybe we're just talking about people moving around and then being entitled to certain rights, or to certain rights and development, let's say. So, and I think we have been already moving in it for a long time. What came particular to your comment now, that we work on the same issue actually from very different disciplines. It's interesting to hear philosophers, lawyers, and social scientists. We always are solving it, and climate change really, since the issue came about, it challenges all these disciplines. I think that came about, and I'm actually very much looking forward to the results, because what I believe, and I would agree with the statements made, is that there is no way back. I mean, you're saying, well, the nation states, they will always exist, etc., or they may change and shift. I don't think that we will have a world without states in the near future, but I think we're certainly moving away from the concept of nation state that we had so far.
Thank you. Teresa, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd be very interested in.
Can you hear? Sorry, can you hear it?
Sorry, yes, I have to turn around a bit more. So I was interested overall in this concept that we're all strangers in a foreign land. We're all climate refugees, and about the world as a global system. And I'd be particularly interested in your ideas, and perhaps people who have read your work would have broader suggestions and as to the perspective on how that relates to legal systems themselves, so global legal systems. And I wasn't terribly clear, if we're all strangers in a foreign land, whether that's justifying geoengineering or how that argument actually follows through for geoengineering, when there seems to be a counterproductive argument in citing the Indigenous people's Aboriginal case in Australia, which is one to protect, as opposed to one not to protect society. So one to protect one select group of people, why not protect people overall?
Interesting. Leonard, yes.
Yes, I must admit that I probably didn't follow everything, but I
I
got the impression a couple of times there was mentioning about a sort of climate change, the crisis so severe that only geoengineering can rescue us or save us, which to me sounds strange, because I see rather geoengineering as the ultimate threat, far more dangerous than the climate change that it is trying to avoid. Because geoengineering will be engineered in such a way that it benefits the ones who have the technology in their hands.
I don't think she's arguing, she mentions it twice, I believe, but I didn't think she was arguing for geoengineering.
No, not for, but it was, I found it a bit strange
Right.
that geoengineering could be sort of a solution, a rescue. That's what I heard at least.
I think she was saying is if the choice, what is usually presented as the stark choice is either a complete fatalism that we can't do anything and we will just sort of embrace the end or become survivalists, or she sees it as one extreme, so geoengineering as an extreme. And so she's saying that choice is not good, and so there must be something between that. So she's seeing it as a concept of like an extremity of a whole spectrum of. So she's definitely not arguing. And then again, you know, she would also be open to understanding geoengineering as something much more, because it's an extremity. You know, humans have always geoengineered. So she's also asking the question, is there any kind of scientific alteration of the planet at the scale of the planet, which could be not capitalist, not territorializing, and not racist? So these are, you know, big questions that they're really about, like undermining the way we usually think of the choices that we have. I think Nigel Clark also is thinking about those kinds of things. Indigenous, I mean, the Australian example that Nigel has written about, you know, the continent has been changed by tens of thousands of years of inhabiting it. So that's also kind of geoengineering.
I guess for me, the question that comes up is, what is she trying to articulate politically by making the suggestion, and it's a convincing one, I have to say, that the climate refugee is the founding condition of the exception, which is sovereignty, citizenship, the state, and so forth. And I guess for me the question would be, what is she trying to accomplish politically in that deconstruction? Yeah, I mean that's what she's doing. So there's a politics there that is interesting. I don't know how it manifests itself. I'm sure it's there in the text. It's probably something along the lines of the Anthropocene opens up the possibility. I mean, if we accept her argument that the climate refugee is the founding condition of sovereignty, citizenship, and the state. Now I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah,
it opens up the possibility of thinking different forms of political community. So the Anthropocene itself opens up the possibility of thinking ourselves as political agents, but not subsumed within these, mechanisms of stratification, to use her word, or mechanisms of capture, which is, sovereignty, property rights, and so forth. So, maybe that's part of the political message that she's delivering. What is political community beyond the nation state or beyond the state?
Right. Yeah, I think this goes back to debates about Derrida and deconstruction. If you're always seeing, that every human population as alien to itself, as not belonging, what does that mean? Can you still think about a body politic or a way of being together as a society? I think that's probably a bit of a blind spot at least in this paper. And in her work in general, she doesn't take very strong political stance. I guess more sort of ethical. She doesn't deal with political theory as such, like should happen in the state, should it be reform or revolution? What kind of feminist politics or anti-racist politics? She's more at this kind of, more abstract level, I suppose.
Are there any other comments or questions or queries or anything from anyone? I think this has been really thought-provoking. It bears mentioning that we are in the process of compiling a number of theoretical interventions that have been made over the course of the cost action at a number of certainly the Working Group 3 events, and compiling those into a text that would be an edited anthology. And we are currently shopping around for a publisher. If you know of a publisher who's dying for interesting content, let me know. And this will be one of the pieces that will appear in that text. So for me, I find this sort of thing very inspiring. It's incredibly creative and really is an aid in my own thinking. But I operate best when I have it in the form of a text that I can work from. So if there's a note of optimism, then that is, we're going to publish this, and you can work from her text if you want. Okay, thank you very much for coming, and my sincere apologies that this wasn't what we had originally intended, but I think nonetheless a provocative use of our time. So thanks, Arun.
And thanks
so
for
much for
staying.
Yeah. Is there an announcement on how to get to University College, or is it here?
Yeah, so University College is at Palace Green, which is in the center of the city. If you go to the cathedral, if you haven't noticed, is this big landmark in the center of town.